What's up gamers, Dreamcastguy here, talking today about the original Last of Us, because this is a game that's won hundreds of awards. It's been praised as one of the best horror projects ever, and is often regarded as a very clear example of gaming as an art form. Well, as many of my subscribers know, I have this personal hobby where I like to try and go back and play stuff again after a couple years just to see how it's aged. I've noticed that sometimes even the most brilliant storytelling and crazy combats can end up looking rather bad after a time. So this week, I decided to do a full playthrough of The Last of Us Remastered. This includes beating the main single player, going through the prequel DLC, and even doing a big chunk of the multiplayer. So let's try and answer the question that's very difficult, which is, in 2020, is this game still good? Now, of course, this is all in preparation for The Last of Us Part 2 that's coming out in a couple weeks. I am going to be reviewing that, but now that I've gone through this first game again, I'm actually even more impressed. This game came out in 2013. It's crazy how much this managed to actually still be so sparkling and great and really polished, even after almost a decade. The first thing that we really need to acknowledge about this project that I think it kind of goes underneath the radar is how well that this journey is constructed. Okay, even if we manage to forget the cool combat, if we just kind of ignore the good writing and stuff, we have to just acknowledge the fact that this game is very expertly paced. At all times, there's usually something you have to explore, an environment that you need to try and solve a puzzle in, or sometimes just an optional dialogue option that can add to these characters so much. There is always something to do in The Last of Us, and what extra makes this impressive to me is that if you really step back and look at it objectively, this game is pretty small. I mean, I did a full playthrough of this on normal difficulty in about 8 hours, and what's funny is that even if we're just not counting the runtime, each of the environments is relatively tiny. The original Last of Us is really the perfect example of guided gameplay. Many of the areas that we're exploring, they are filled with enemies, items, and little elements of environmental detail, but the big thing is that if you notice, if you try and go outside the main spots, if you start checking the corners and stuff, you can see that they're actually relatively barren. The developers, they don't want you to go there. They don't want you to look at that. And so what they decided to do is they kind of very casually funnel you towards the most interesting elements. But I don't mean this as an insult. Instead, I really think that this is a huge credit to their design philosophy that they can make this land seem so big and alive when in fact it's relatively tiny. I think part of this comes down to as well, the way that this game works is what I like to call structured plot adaptive fighting. There is one main story. There's not optional stuff. There's not really like side quests. Instead, you're pretty much just walking from one place to another, accomplishing tiny objectives and moving on. But what keeps it fresh is that it keeps you going towards this next spot. It tries to introduce you to like a cool character and a nice cutscene, and then it throws in a lot of adaptive fighting. There are two main groups of enemies in this game, and despite the fact that they act and fight so differently, I feel like the way we have to handle them is very much the same. So you're going to be fighting against other humans who are typically enemy factions. They're scavengers that try and kill you because they want to eat you or steal your guns or rob you. But then there's also the other thing, which is the infected. A big part of what makes The Last of Us so great is the fact that it is a zombie game. I know some people hate the word zombie when it's used in certain contexts, but in this case, these creatures are walking around, they're trying to bite your neck, they're pretty much the shambling corpses we've seen in other games. But the reason they work here is because they managed to be so scientific. The clickers are being grown from these spore-like things that have managed to jump over to the human species. Any human that manages to get a scratch or a nick or sometimes even just like a little nibble on their ankle, you will become one of the infected. But the thing is that there are different versions of this. When you first get bit, you turn into what they call a runner. They almost look human, but with very, very disheveled clothing. They usually just bark and claw and bite, and then over time, they slowly start to sprout this weird, creepy, mollusk-style fungus fungus out of their necks until their entire head is this huge blooming infection. But this makes them more dangerous instead of easier. While these clickers are now blind, they're unable to see you, they are a lot more deadly. They don't feel pain, you can blast them all day long, but they're basically armored by the spores themselves. This ends up making it so we have two fundamentally very different styles of combat. The humans will shoot you, they'll try and pick up weapons off the ground and throw them at you. I mean, they're constantly trying to find any way possible to just cut your freaking throat. Whereas the clickers, they're also dangerous because in both circumstances, you cannot be seen. These creatures, whether they be breathing or not, they're something that absolutely wants to try and shred you at any cost possible. But what I like about this is that whenever you're playing the game, you're perpetually dropped into these tiny, very scripted arenas. A lot of times you'll have there'll be like a door that locks or something, and suddenly you're in a room that has a bunch of chest-high walls and you need to try and sneak around and systematically remove the threats one by one, either by stealth kills, using your bigger weapons, or sometimes just by brute force and bashing their brains out. What works so fundamentally well about this, though, is that it feels good. I mean, the biggest thing about this is, even playing this now, 7 years later, I am just absolutely in love with how much it just works to get that stealth kill and drop an enemy and trying to sneak past somebody else, or running into the boss fights. This is a huge thing now that I really acknowledge more now than I did when I played this, so long ago, is that I really love that there are human boss fights in the form of things like a big truck that's trying to trace you down, or like a human that's particularly well armed, but then there will also be infected boss fights in the form of bloaters, or a room that's particularly thick with clickers. It makes it where there's this nice ebb and flow of fear. There's those chances where you get a chance to catch your breath and acknowledge that the world is just so screwed up, and then suddenly you're right back into what makes this so screwed up. I do want to say that as much as I love this combat, it doesn't always feel appropriate. There's definitely a lot of times in this game where the story is incredibly well acted. Joel and Ellie, this father and this child, who aren't related but are just stuck together. The overall mission of the game is trying to walk basically across America to get to a lab and possibly find a cure for this infection virus. The story itself is incredibly heavy, dealing with loss, pain, killing your family members. I mean, just so much in this is so heavy. And at times, I wish that they were able to put a little bit of less fighting in it. You can tell that the developers were afraid of making this a little bit too story heavy. There are times where there is an actual cutscene going on, people are really kind of pouring their hearts out, and then they pause that to put in a firefight, where like a bunch of just random, like raiders will break into the base, you kill them, and they go right back to the cutscene. It's pretty apparent that Naughty Dog was worried of this coming off as an interactive movie and not so much of the horror game that it's trying to be. But in other ways, I think that this also makes sense. I mean, they wanted this to be fun, they wanted this to be active, they wanted you to participate in the universe instead of just watching it unfold. And I feel like this works so much on a fundamental level. I love that this game, it constantly puts tiny things to make it where you're engaged in the universe. It goes beyond just wanting to see how these characters go. It's more than just hoping they get a happily ever after. I feel like they try and make it where Joel and Ellie, you can see how their relationship grows and evolves. And in some ways, I think that this is some of the best writing that's ever been in a video game. Something that really functions the best in this game is the optional dialogues, which you can completely miss. There is a huge amount of plot in this game that you can just straight up walk past. Times like if you're in a crowded street and all the enemies are gone and you're just sitting there in traffic for a second, you can just take a moment to look at a sign of a movie poster for a film that's never going to get a sequel because the apocalypse happened. And Ellie, who's grown up after the world's already collapsed, she has no idea what this is. She probably hasn't seen that many movies. I mean, she can't even imagine the idea of a horror movie when her life is a horror movie. I mean, it's so nice to see these characters have this moment of reflection of how different their lives are, and yet they still have the same objective. this also goes beyond verbal. There is a lot of environmental storytelling in this game that is the best of any project I have ever seen in my life. Like, there is a lot of times where if you continue to explore, there's definitely a big push to encourage you to constantly scavenge. There is a big crafting system in this game that allows you to go around, pick up parts, construct your own health kits and explosives, and do things like upgrade your weapons. The game wants to try and push you into checking those side rooms and being a good scavenger instead of being the hunter that runs into the fight. But more than this, there's these notes. There's all sorts of stuff that's tucked around the environment that if you choose to read these and choose to connect the dots, you realize that there's a lot of people that have already lost. There's a lot of people who have tried their best to survive and they've managed to fight off the zombies for a while, but eventually they get that one bite or they get that one scratch. By far, the most shining example of this is Ish. I-S-H. There's a part of the game where you're going along and you discover a boat that's washed up on shore, and in it is this guy named Ish's diary. He begins by talking about the infection breaking out while he's on shore, so he jumps in his boat and goes out to sea, and he stays there until eventually he starts running out of food, so he comes back, and he discovers an underground network of sewer tunnels. So he creates this tiny city for himself, a little house, a little civilization, and after a time, people start coming into these tunnels, and you see his notes kind of questioning, should I let others stay here? Isn't that dangerous? What if an infected gets in? But Ish, according to these letters, we see that eventually he decided to let people stay. They come and become part of this underground community, and we can see that this lasted for years. People living in secret, children getting a chance to grow up, getting a chance to be with their parents, playing games, all in the safety of this little tiny hovel, even though the world outside is a hellscape. Until eventually, we can see the final letters talk about someone did get inside, and they were bit, and they did turn, and they ended up trying to kill everybody, and some of the last survivors decided to turn the guns on the kids to make sure they didn't get eaten alive. It is incredibly dark, it is extremely macabre, but I feel like this is such an essential part of the Last of Us universe, and it's something that could be completely missed. If you were just running from Objective A to Objective B, you would never know the story of Ish. This is a tale that is so deep and so heartfelt, and it is a zero spoken word story. There is no audio, it is just this character that we never see. It is just something that unfolds in the universe in such a natural state. And for that reason, I still feel like it is a game that manages to work so well. This kind of carries over to how I feel about the prequel DLC, because Left Behind, it's not necessary. I mean, technically, you could just go straight from Last of Us 1 to Last of Us 2, I bet, but I feel like getting a chance to see this prequel and seeing Ellie before she met Joel, seeing Ellie playing with her friends in this mall and just having fun, and seeing what life was like before her world is just completely ripped to shreds. It creates this added element that feels, it just kind of gives you this extra meat on the bones that feels rewarding, and it definitely makes it so The Last of Us, it has more purpose. The story and writing in this game is good. The voice acting is truly top notch. I mean, these people won a lot of awards for what they did here, but more than that, I think that everything combines together to create a sense that this feels real. It truly feels like something that couldn't be conveyed as well in a television show or a book. This is something that we had to see, to walk around in, to experience, to truly understand. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is the multiplayer, because in my memories, I kind of hated the multiplayer back in the day. When this came out in 2013, and of course re-released on the PlayStation 4 in 2014, I didn't exactly love the multiplayer. It kind of seemed tacked on, but now that I'm going back and trying it again, I definitely have a much deeper respect for it. The Last of Us multiplayer is like this 4v4 fights, where players are trying to scavenge around in buildings to try and construct weapons, you spawn with one gun of your choice, and there is a surprising amount of depth to the class system. Being able to call targets, or being able to try and scope a target and blast somebody's brains as quickly as possible, this is incredibly savage. And by far the most surprising aspect of this is that there are still huge amounts of the online community here today. There are hundreds and hundreds of people that are on this at any time. Like, even though this game came out almost 10 years ago, every time I tried to play this, I instantly had an online game. There's still people that are out there leveling up, trying this out, and honestly being pretty chill about it. Even when I lost to these people, because some of these players were absolute pros, nobody was a jerk. This was a surprisingly inviting community, and I'm kind of impressed. I kind of want to go back and play more of the multiplayer, because even the single player, while I enjoyed it, I definitely think that this is one of those games that I only need to beat every couple of years. The multiplayer, though, it's addictive because of just how brutal it is. It's nice to try and bash somebody's freaking head off, or if you just manage to flank somebody and steal all their guns. I like this game, but more than that, I definitely just kind of admire it. I am extremely thankful that I decided to go through this again, and I definitely think that the sequel is definitely well set up. I'm hoping a lot for The Last of Us Part 2. I'm still a little bit skeptical that it can rise up to being this nice, but I'm definitely here for it. It's very difficult to try and put a score on this game because I already love it so much, but if I had to put a rating on it, I would definitely give it a 10 out of 10. This is still a game that deserves all the praise, all the support, everything the community has managed to lump upon it. This game still manages to rise up to its absolute potential. But I guess now all I can do is wait the 2 weeks to get The Last of Us Part 2. Thanks so much for watching, gamers. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share with your friends, and subscribe if you haven't already. But do me the biggest favor of all and keep dreaming. I am going to be doing a review of Last of Us 2. I've just seen so many people asking that. Yes, I do plan on doing a big, deep dive review to check out what's good or bad about it. So definitely look for that in the future. Thanks so much for watching that video. If you want to see something else, you can always click this link to see what I put up last, or, subscribe and see what's coming up next. Also, I promise that whatever I do, it'll try not to suck.